Topic today is fake ed. There's been a lot of fake in the fake news lately. So we want to talk about the lack of evidence and the issue of efficacy in this new world order where technology and education are coming and trying to play together in the same ecosystem. It's obviously not a new debate, but I think this framing of this question I really like, because I remember years ago the question was, how does the VC/entrepreneur get to the procurement office in a school district? I like that this is being framed in the sense that, once you're at the door, what do you got to show for it, right? And obviously it's a two-way street. We've got school districts that need to understand what kind of questions they have to ask, how they should be informed, what kind of research they need to be doing. Do they even care about the research? Do they need to know about the research? And then obviously at the technology side, what is it that you need to know to sort of make this relationship better? So according to one of our panelists, I think, Bert, you had this piece of information. I'll introduce them in a second. We spent in 2016 $13.2 billion on ed tech for K-12. That's a lot of money. So before we launch into our conversation, I do hope that also we can walk away today with maybe some next steps, so it's not just a big discussion, but that we actually have some pointers to share with you when we leave today. So at around 4:45, which is 15 minutes before we end, hopefully we can, maybe we can even write them on the board. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So, and we obviously want your input too. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. They're, sorry. Whose credentials, this is basically the Cliff Notes version because we would be here all day if I was actually going to tell you everything about them. So to my direct left is Rick Hess. He's the resident scholar and director of Ed Policy Studies at AEI in Washington, where he works on K-12 and higher ed issues. He's also a prolific writer. I have no idea how many books he's written, but it's a lot. And he also writes for an Education Week opinion blog called Rick Hess Straight Up. Next, we have Bart Epstein. Did I pronounce the Epstein correctly? Okay. He's based at UVA, University of Virginia. He's the founding CEO of Jefferson Education Accelerator and managing director of the Jefferson Education Fund. He also was helpful in building Tutor.com, which is very successful at doing exactly what their name suggests. Then we have Lauren Henderson. She is based in Wilmington, North Carolina. She is president of Tech Mountain, which is an innovation center, correct? Built within its parent company, Kessel Branch. So we're going to ask her to maybe clarify a little bit about the work that they do. And then we have Ruth Neild, who's the director of the Philadelphia Research Consortium, or PERC. And their job is to work with schools to really help, sort of facilitate this research issue. She's also worked at the the Department of Education at the federal level for the Institute of Education and Science, and she has done a lot of things there, including working with the What Works Clearinghouse. So thanks all for coming today to help us have this conversation. Obviously, this relationship is a complicated one. We're talking about a universe that also obviously involves public and private money, which is always complicated. And we have this sort of bureaucratic, sometimes dinosaur model of an education school system, right, that meets up with innovators who don't necessarily speak bureaucracy. So, what do we do about that? So the first question I'd like to pose to all of our panelists is, how do you balance this reality? This issue of research, technology, kind of butting heads with the bureaucracy and the innovation sort of side of the ecosystem. So let's start with Ruth. You're kind of dealing with this at the school level, and what do you see as sort of the big issue, the juggernaut that's really confronting both sides of the equation?
Sure, wow, so many things. So, I think some of the issue is related to things that we talk quite a bit about, is that there is a lot of technology. I think districts are bombarded often with vendors, folks who want to sell things that range from large platforms to online courses to apps to classroom apps. And I think it is really challenging for districts and for educators to sort through the whole range of technology that's available and that changes all the time, to really think about what are the kinds of technology that fit my particular needs? What are the questions that I should be asking about the usability of this technology, how it will fit in with this particular curriculum that I happen to have. And also, and these are the kinds of things that really interest me particularly, sort of is this technology effective? Does it work? And so I think one of the things I would just kind of like to get out here in the room and on the panel is that I think we need to unpack the question about, like, does it work? Because that means different things for different people. Does it work for what? And I think one of the things that is missing in the relationship between technology and education, and frankly, even, forget technology and education sort of banging up against each other, even in their separate worlds, I don't think we have clear and common vocabulary for talking about what we mean and how we would know when something works.
Great answer. Lauren, maybe you could also clarify a little bit. First, tell us a little bit about what you do, and then maybe you want to take a stab at that question.
Sure.
Like, how does it work in Tech Mountain?
Yeah, absolutely. So Castle Branch is our parent company. And Castle Branch is a compliance management company that really works in the space for college and universities with nursing and allied health students. We work with about 2/3 of the colleges in the country providing that type of compliance management for those nursing and allied health students. 3 years ago, we formed Tech Mountain as an internal innovation center, because as we continue to grow, we really wanted to bring that type of innovation and innovative and entrepreneurial spirit back into our corporate world. So Tech Mountain really focuses on really expanding, exploring, and extending that life cycle that we work with the student in that higher ed capacity. And so Tech Mountain is building those relationships throughout the country, seeing what type of extensions we can add. Ruth and I were talking a little bit earlier too, and I think another part of the question is what type of technology and who is the user and what is it trying to solve? Because the type of research and the type of rigor that is needed probably to evaluate each kind differs. And how do we define that, and how do we make that clear so that different parties know what are the standards that we need for each different area?
So Bart, I'm going to maybe have you respond to what Lauren just said. So maybe you can also explain a little bit about the work that you do at UVA, and then talk maybe a little bit to this issue that Lauren just addressed.
Sure.
And can everybody hear okay? You guys might need to speak up into the mic.
Thank you. This makes me want to sing. Great to see you all. To give you context, I'll tell you about our journey and how we got where we are, which is very frustrating, but very contextually relevant. So about 4 years ago, we decided to launch a growth stage company accelerator out of the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. The goal being to help the most promising growth stage education companies succeed on the basis of merit rather than marketing. To work with companies that made it past the startup phase, that so often ran face first into the reality of how difficult it is to build an education company, to deal with the politics and the bureaucracy, to raise money, to make sales, all while trying to build a great product and prove that it works. And as we started to work with individual companies, we found it very frustrating that we would continually pick companies, some who we meet here and through other incubators, whose products are clearly superior to their competitors. But their competitors have better brands, they're bigger, they have better distribution and more money, and as a result, they win in the marketplace. And so we've been trying to help these companies do more research, but very few people on the demand side are particularly interested in or able to understand research. And this is a problem. So we decided to survey a large number of people to ask them whose responsibility do they think efficacy research is. And the results of this research was fascinating. We talked to leading investors, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, policymakers, district leaders, higher ed leaders, And they all had the same number one answer: not me. Everyone thinks it's someone else's responsibility. And so we decided to bring together about 150 of these people. We formed 10 working groups that spent a year with the support of 10 different professional researchers digging into some of these questions about why isn't efficacy research used more, and what can we do about it? And the short answer is, it's largely a demand problem. You can't blame the entrepreneurs and the investors for not spending their precious money doing research if research isn't driving sales.
Okay, Rick. Let's have a reality take here. You kind of exist in the 30,000 foot level. You connect with a lot of people. What is your sense? I mean, there's also another study that came out of UVA that said something like only 11% of district administrators, this is done by Michael Kennedy, I believe, only 11% of district administrators said that they would flatly reject buying or adopting ed tech products if they lacked peer-reviewed research. So does the research even matter? What do you, I mean, from the schoolhouse perspective or the district perspective, I mean, how do we resolve this problem? Get people to care? Do we just let it go? What do you think?
I mean, it's a lot of chicken and egg. I mean, partly, most of the research is crap. And so you've got a lot of people I mean, this goes back to reading first 15 years ago. You had a lot of people, you have who commission the research, or foundations which fund research on their agendas. We find this enormous body of positive results. So when you spend much time with principals and superintendents, it's totally reasonable that so many of them are so skeptical about so much of this stuff. BART's helping, grow companies that are seeking to grow. When these guys go out and put together partnerships with researchers, this is the same temptations exist in every walk of life, but this is also why you've got like this infrastructure in healthcare with FDA frameworks and alpha and beta trials and stuff under third-party oversight, because people are reasonably skeptical. Now, it's also true that we've got a lot of principals and superintendents who've got little or no training in research, who don't know how to make sense of research, who don't have anybody who can advise them. So again, it's chicken and egg, but it is funny that whenever you sit in a room, whoever's telling the story is always the good guy, and those other frustrating people out there are the ones who don't quite get it.
Everyone else's fault.
Right. So Ruth, I'm curious, in your working with, I know that there's consortiums, in Chicago, what are the other cities? DC?
New Orleans, Baltimore,
Yeah.
San Francisco.
So what does that look like? Can you walk us through a little bit of that experience?
Sure. I think that these kinds of partnerships might hold potential for both working on the supply end and the demand end, and maybe bringing together some of these folks, everyone who was just like, not I, but sort of saying, okay, well, maybe this is something that we can do together. So the research practice partnership that I work in, and that examples of which exist in different places across the country, is really trying to do high-quality, rigorous research that is conceived of, developed alongside of education practitioners, whether they are at the school level, whether they are district administrators, whether they are at the state. And the idea of these partnerships is that when you bring together researchers and practitioners to think about what are the most important questions. And each one of them, there's sort of this, a partnership, there's mutuality, there's sort of shared decision-making over the research agenda, that the results will be more actionable, that you have sort of a built-in audience that's really interested in the results of the findings, and that in the end, the research is also better too, because researchers are sort of getting out of their ivory towers and really engaging with very practical problems. And maybe just like one of the things that I do is in this partnership is it's not just sort of about doing research and let's write a paper, let's produce a public report. It's really trying to think about, well, what are the other kinds of ways in which trained researchers can be working alongside district folks to think about how research can inform practice. So one of the things that I've done in the past year that I've been in this partnership working with the school district of Philadelphia and charter schools in Philadelphia is to work with their research office and their procurement office to think about, well, how could we incorporate some extra points for vendors who are able to bring forward research that meets certain quality standards? And how would we operationalize that? How would we get that reviewed? And how would we communicate to vendors that this was really important? So,
Yeah, I mean, I was going to actually, my follow-up was just going to be like actually the process. So like, how much exact engagement do you have with the district? Like, what does that actually look like?
you know, I think it looks different in different partnerships, but I think, you know, relationships are essential. It's sort of easy to talk about them. You have to have a good relationship, but there needs to be sort of a sense of trust on both sides, and a sense that, you know, the research is willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and work alongside them. So for me, what that means is going and working at the district every Friday, just to have lots and lots of face time, and that's where sort of the conversations come up. And it's like, hey, we can do this. You know? So there's just sort of constant back and forth, whether it's face to face or whether it's on.
But do they come to you with a product? I mean, how does that, like, are they saying, we're thinking about buying X, can you help us figure out, or is it not that specific?
Well, and, you know, for the procurement that I was working on, it was one of those every 2 years, here's a list of approved vendors kinds of things. And I think that's actually a really key moment where districts can be thinking about how can we actually get some evidence on the effectiveness of this particular intervention. And that, you know, whether this is an intervention that works better to improve some outcome than some other reasonable alternative, I think is part of the procurement decision. It's not the only thing in a procurement decision. You also want to know a bit about sort of, you know, usability. What are other people saying about this particular intervention? So it's sort of in the context of a bigger decision-making process, but it's important to have that.
Somebody, I think, had put their hand up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just building off of that, is there research that is being done not just on efficacy, but usability or difficulty of adoption, right? Are these things that are being researched, or are researchers kind of sticking to the sexier, like, ooh, like new AI program, like how effective is it when it's been already 100% implemented, you know, and the teachers are completely on board and everybody's like already gung-ho, right? What sort of research is being done for these other elements that are so crucial?
You were leaning forward. I think I've got a great story to tell.
So that's the best question I've ever heard.
I don't know if it's a high bar or a low bar.
So we have a collective action problem in our country. Nobody understands what works where, under what circumstances. And this is a terrible problem because, as you so succinctly and brilliantly put it, knowing that a certain product works in Miami-Dade and the research was done with rigor and thought to high enough levels of care that it can be published in the reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse favorably, doesn't mean that the company didn't pick their best customer with the longest relationship, where the founder lives nearby, where the teachers are given extra support. It may have nothing to do with your district. And this, we'll get to some of the possible solutions later, but this is a problem we have that's based on fragmentation. With 14,000 plus school districts in the country, most people are not working in the 20 largest districts. They're largely on their own, and they're jacks of all trades. They are struggling to figure out what they want, and when they finally implement something and they learn the hard way that they didn't get enough teacher buy-in, or they never should have bought it because it doesn't interoperate with the professional development platform, that information generally goes nowhere. And we need to build a system that allows people on the front lines to report their real-world implementation data.
So before we get to the next question, I just want to ask Lauren, like, what's your sense of pace of technology and time it takes to actually get something, to the schoolhouse door, for example.
For us, when we're developing stuff, we're trying to release on two-week cycles at times. So we're doing, constant customer feedback loops of our users and having that cycle and making the changes based on the feedback that we're getting. So to send out and do larger studies versus the customer feedback that we're getting, is a challenge when you're trying to move at the pace of a startup or an innovative culture. So those are certainly challenges that we have from balancing those things out.
Yes, sir. I don't know if there's a mic around here.
So I have a background in field sales. I was in the classroom on and off for almost over 7 years, and I've done some medtech marketing. And I think one of the issues is the lack of understanding, like you had touched upon. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of nuances. You have so many different school districts, and you have these marketers that don't have the education background. They're creating this messaging that creates objections. For example, I worked at one edtech company, and they were saying things like, "We're going to cut overhead." But I'm thinking to myself, well, how are you going to do that when you have collective bargaining agreements and you have to build trust, like you had said before? That doesn't build trust with the people who need to implement the product into the school. So unless you have people in marketing who are teachers who understand what it's like to be a teacher, the pain points, and to help support to do the research, to buy personas or potential efficacy research, I don't think it'll be successfully adopted in the long term in terms of the sales cycle and things of that nature.
So what's your question?
Well, my question is my question I would say is, what are some of the ways we could, flatten the sales cycle in terms of being more transparent with the information, making it be more adopted quicker, and just, being able to solve a larger issue.
So I'm going to ask Rick if you would take a wager on that, since you're not directly involved in any of this, but you have kind of a larger frame.
On which part?
That question. Sorry, can you ask it again?
Sure.
Well, one of the things I would say is that, what are some of the ways, we could potentially bring teachers into the marketing function of the organization, and also to have them do research to flatten out that sales cycle and be transparent about the information and the nuances of the different school districts. Like, what are some of the steps that we could take?
So basically, I don't know. I'm not in sales, so I can't speak to that.
Sure.
I would say that there's a couple things going on. One is when we talk about efficacy, which is kind of a big, fancy-sounding word, but efficacy towards what, right? A lot of this stuff, it's evaluated on whether or not it was reading a math course, and whether or not it was reading a math course between one assessment of Terra Nova and the next assessment of Terra Nova. And, it's true when you're selling to districts that they have a fixation on reading a math course nowadays, but it turns out parents actually don't. So when we think about whether these things are being shown to be efficacious in terms of who you're selling it to, that's one thing. Second thing is, teachers, one, they come to the profession. Huge numbers of teachers, you know that you've been in classrooms, have just a really bad taste in their mouth towards vendors in general, and towards the whole political economy of people who they see as sleazeballs surrounding vendors, the foundation types, and the researchers, and the evaluators, and the marketers. And it all feels like a whole bunch of people who've got a whole bunch of interesting agendas who get to, have nice lives without actually helping them solve problems. And so to the extent that you're talking about engaging practitioners, I think the extent to which they feel like they are being brought in to assist with the multi-level marketing strategy, they are going to be unhelpful and disdainful. To the extent that you actually want to get practitioners engaged, I think the question has to be framed in terms of how do you actually help them do their jobs well. And when you start those conversations, you realize how far afield a lot of our talk about efficacy is from the stuff that teachers say are their real day-to-day frustrations.
Yeah, and actually our reporter, and then we'll get to you, sir, our reporter, Sean Kavanaugh, actually recently reported about this, that procurement often is more about if it's going to be helpful to the educator, rather than the needs of the educator, rather than if it's going to have undergone research, to your point. So yes, sir, in the back.
So the big question is, how do you balance efficacy of product versus efficacy of implementation? Because, and I know on the Jefferson side you struggle with that because the size of the implementation doesn't necessarily always warrant the district to buy in. And so the question, right, that's the big question, is the efficacy on the product or the implementation? And which one are you actually measuring? Or are you measuring?
This is a really important point about which would you, if you had to choose, if you were spending some federal research dollars, what kind of research would you rather fund? Would you rather have an academic paper about the effectiveness of Alvin math in a district where it's implemented perfectly, or would you rather have Alvin math studied in 50 different districts to understand why does the same product thrive here, struggle here, and every shade in between? And I think most educators would say they want the latter. But we don't currently have a practitioner-driven research agenda. And that's something that I think needs to change. And I think momentum will start shifting in that direction, because the data seems to show that a mediocre product implemented well is far more valuable to students and teachers than a great product implemented poorly.
So let me offer just a different, I think that's all really useful and right. Let me offer just a different way to think about it also. When we're talking, we talk a lot about the medical research models. Let's just go with that for a second. If we're talking about a new drug intervention for an anti-cancer targeting agent, we're actually worried about, does it work? Does it work on average? So when you do these drug trials, you give it to 500 people, and you see on average, does it make them healthier? That's real different from like how folks in healthcare think about, say, childhood obesity, where you're not giving an intervention to a distinct client, but where you're saying, hey, if we build lots of jungle gyms and encourage kids to eat healthy, and there, that second one, that childhood obesity stuff, turns out context and implementation matter a ton. So we tend to turn these things into these, into these caricatures. Am I for studying implementation? This is a debate that's going back to the early 70s at least in the world of education policy. Am I for studying implementation strategies, or am I for, and what I'm suggesting is actually it depends a lot on what you're studying. If we're talking about a homework app which reminds a parent to check in with their kid, it turns out that the fidelity of implementation is probably pretty consistent. Just like when you use Uber, it tends to be pretty consistent. If we're talking about some kind of high-touch mentoring program, it turns out that implementation is probably the whole ballgame. But what happens is by the time we boil these things down to our PowerPoint decks, we tend to want them nicely stylized in a way that we lose so much of what really matters in my experience.
Christy, you're nodding a lot. Do you want to jump in here and add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think both of these things are important. And, I think the platforms that we have right now are really only partial. And so I guess what I would argue is not that sort of the whole tablecloth needs to be pulled, and we need to think about things completely differently, but we need to think about how to sort of augment the things that we have. So I'll take the example of what works with Clearinghouse, which some people love to love and some people love to hate. And I think it has examples of this efficacy research. One example was the effectiveness of this particular intervention on these outcomes. And it describes implementation to the extent that that is reported in the paper, but it doesn't go further than that. I think the Clearinghouse has a role to do that, but I don't think it's enough for decision makers. And so I think what's actually the kind of thing we should be thinking about, I know there are some different folks thinking about this. I think there are some foundations who are involved in this. I think, that could, the ones with great integrity are involved in this. But they're trying to think about how is it that we can take the kind of information that the Clearinghouse provides with other information that other people can provide. Maybe it's through formal implementation research. Maybe it's through reviews from people who are using this in their own districts or in their own schools. And I think, again, it goes back to thinking about decision-making as not sort of like thumbs up, thumbs down, oh, it worked in Miami, so it must work here, right? It's much more sort of contingent, and it involves making meaning of things and making decisions when there's maybe not always one clear answer, but what you do want to have is a bunch of different data points to say, looking at these data, I'm going to make a bet that this is going to work. I think in the end, no amount of research that we could do in Miami, like we go with 50 districts, and then the 51st district will be like, well, that's not me. So you have to kind of think about, well, really the model here is that I'm trying to learn from other people's experience to kind of imagine what my future as a district or a teacher or a school is going to be like with this app or this other piece of technology. And then that should, the logic model would go, help me to make a more informed decision. It might not work in my context, but I will feel much more comfortable that I've made a better investment, having completely thrown my money away, if I have been able to look at these other kinds of both, efficacy and implementation.
So my name's Marjorie Meyer. I was in charge of Read 180. We're in the What Works Clearinghouse, and I've had a lot of experience with districts that could make Read 180 work, and then going to other districts that say, well, it can't work here. And I could not disagree with more with what you said about Miami. I mean, if you
Miami was a random example.
Okay, whatever. Pick a district where something actually worked. Okay, so maybe those conditions were special, but it actually worked. And there's so much bullshit, and people are making such big claims about stuff, that at least if you can say, that worked under these conditions, that gets a check mark. Now, I think one of the big challenges is what Rick said, which is everybody wants to show that it can make a change on a test. And some things just cannot make a change on a test, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used. And in your example, Rick, of an app that reminds a parent about homework, how do you measure what the efficacy is of that? I don't even think efficacy is the right word for something like that. And I don't know where customers are supposed to go to figure out what are the best things. Teachers are going to places on their own that aren't quote-unquote sanctioned by the industry. And I just want to say one more thing. Every time somebody says the word bureaucrats about schools, it bothers me in this context, and I'll tell you why. School districts have a fiduciary responsibility to do the right thing. And it's not unreasonable for them to want to have a careful decision-making process about what they're doing. And I think it's part of your point, like, how do we help them have a better decision-making process? My question would be, I know I'm ranting and raving, but my question would be, where are school districts and teachers supposed to go to find out what will work? And I'm not talking about the What Works Clearinghouse, because the standard there is just, it's really hard. Young companies cannot meet that standard. It's just too tough. Like, if somebody comes to you and says, where should I go to find out what works? Where do you tell them to go? Sorry to be ranting and raving, but I usually do.
So Michael Kennedy and I and some of the people in this room studied this issue last year. We looked at what are the sources of information that are aggregating formal and informal product reviews, feedback, efficacy research data. And the answer is that there are quite a few sources of data. One of them is Learn Trials. I think I saw Carl here somewhere out of North Carolina that is collecting, that is going into schools and managing their ed tech implementations and collecting data from teachers about their actual implementations that they can share within their growing network. You have EdSurge, you have App Ed Review, you have Common Sense Media. If you go to, if you search for EdTech Efficacy Research Symposium, we have a working paper put out by our working group that describes what these sources are, but we also talk about there the shortcoming with almost all of these sources is that, with the exception of, I believe, Ed Elements, which takes a very deep dive in curriculum and is funded by philanthropy, most of these reviews are Yelp-style reviews, and they lack the context that we all crave. So there'll be a paragraph that says, this is the greatest app ever, it's changed my life, my students are doing better, my hair is growing back, I got a raise. But you don't know what the environment is like in their school, and that's a big problem. And it's a collective action problem, and something that we're thinking hard about how to fix. And I suppose at the end, I'll tell you what we think we can do.
But I also think the issue, I mean, to your point, I think that school districts don't necessarily, I mean, we may know because we're on the outside or, sort of looking in, but I think from the inside of the school district, I can't imagine that there's a ton of teachers like going to EdSurge or EdWeek or some other place to find out a product review. And I think that's really probably to your point, right?
It's not teachers pay teachers.
Right,
See
exactly.
what the favorite thing is there.
And it's even harder now because there are more than 50 different product niches. So think back to when, at least some of us were in school, the only education technology was CD-ROM encyclopedia. There were 2 brands, they were both pretty good.
Right, so like how do we solve that problem? I don't know, do you guys have other people have any other suggestions? Or anybody in the audience that has, an answer to this question? Wait, we're still on this, we're not gonna take the next question. If you have an answer for Margaret, that's great, but I don't wanna go to the next question yet. Panelists, do you have any sort of sense of, do you have a sense?
I don't know that I think we have great solutions yet, so I think that's why we're just sort of tossing out these different ideas. I would say that I think it is a myth that is too hard to get into, to be reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse and meet with reservations. That is a gigantic second tier that ranges from nearly good to almost awful. Okay, it's a really big range.
But I don't think that helps you sell when you get that.
What's that?
I don't think that helps you sell when you get that when you're in there with reservations. People don't know what that means.
Well, I think they might start to know what it means if we think about, for example, the way some of this has been put into the Every Student Succeeds Act. So there are these different tiers of evidence. First tier of evidence, which is essentially, corresponds to sort of needs without reservations on the clearinghouse, and then the second tier meets with reservations. I see that starting to catch people's eye. So I think it's sort of a long game to think about that way. But I think you're right that you wouldn't go to the clearinghouse right now because there's just not enough there about technology. And I think one of the things, as I've sort of been reflecting on the clearinghouse and a year away from IES, I think the clearinghouse was sort of set up at a time when there was a whole backlog of stuff that needed to be reviewed, and it was kind of like big curricula, big programs, that kind of thing. And I think it's been set up that way. My guess is it will start to change and be more nimble. And I think the kinds of questions that you're asking, the kinds of points that Bart and others have been making about sort of needing to have some quicker turnaround kinds of products. The people who work on the clearinghouse, they're called bureaucrats too. They're not. They're super smart people. And they're really trying to figure this out as well.
So there was a gentleman back there with the gray suit that had a question.
David Cantor from Calvert Education. Really appreciate the comments. I just really mostly wanted to add a little bit of information from personal experience with a different medical research model, improvement science, which can lead to that checklist that gets the doctors to wash their hands, that ultimately reduces contamination rates. And I assume folks are informed about this, but I just wanted to mention that the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching has been using this Network Improvement Committee model that is kind of practitioner-driven case studies in coordination, and New York City also has a Gates grant doing similar work. I had a chance to try it myself, and having been more of a traditional researcher, just found it really interesting as an alternative paradigm. It's hard to know how to get that context in it. Your driver diagrams have a lot of those contextual variables in it, but it's still hard to know how to boil it down and and share it with people, but I think there's something there. So I just wanted to throw that into the ring as another way to think about this kind of research. Thanks.
I think the gentleman back there with the pink shirt, did you have a question?
So the question was to get your thoughts on a couple things. One, what do you think about there being a problem with investors kind of only wanting things that are digitally scalable and not wanting to invest in sort of organizations that build mentoring, build high-touch implementation? And the other thing is, going off the speakers this morning, like the need for software development to be done in-house in the school, like at the basis schools, where they develop that curriculum sharing thing. So what do you think about, what are ways that development can be done inside the school or inside a teaching center or something like that?
Anybody? Lauren, do you want to?
Yeah, the first part of investors wanting something that's digitally scalable. As an investment partner, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for something that we can scale and replicate and expand and do different things. So, from our business model, those are the type of things that we're looking for. Again, just going back to some of the other comments too of how we apply different standards. I think it comes back to what specific tools we're talking about. For us, we're based on administrator tools. That's going to have different research needs, but we're expanding to tools that will help with test prep. That, I think, needs a much longer cycle, and we'll have to go through different standards that I would want procurement to be asking us if it has met those standards, compared to its competitors. But the administrator tool, no, it may not need that same type of explanation there.
An interesting piece of this too is, that's what any investor or developer is going to want to do. But parents and teachers tend to experience schools as very personal institutions. And when they hear people, even using the language of scalable digital offerings, they start to immediately get their hackles up. It sounds, and this is not unreasonable, because part of the backdrop here is it's important to keep in mind that education, for whatever reason, has historically been a space filled with dabblers and hobbyists. You go to major foundations, you'll find lots of people who've been doing education less than a half dozen years. They got their master's degree at Kennedy School, they're working at a major foundation, and then they're going to go off. Once they've really made their bones, they'll go off to healthcare. Or if you're working in a VC, you train on education, and then you get to go to real business development. And so education has filled a lot of people who are very excited and passionate and talk about how the world's going to change. And especially for educators and folks in the system who've been there for a while, a lot of this stuff starts to sound real reminiscent of things that they heard excitedly talked about 6 years ago or 16 years ago. The MOOCs, for instance, for people who've been around long enough, was exactly a replay of FAFSA at Columbia University, which chewed up $30 million in the late 90s and then sank without a trace. Sank without a trace so much that all the stories about MOOCs usually never even referenced FAFSA when they were kind of doing the backstory of how you got there. So what happens is what developers and what entrepreneurs want to provide is a useful tool that can be helpful for educators and parents in doing their work. But what parents and teachers hear and experience is somebody who is little or no appreciation for the realities of how they're thinking about school, who come in selling a product and feeling like they're shilling, and then what you wind up with is a real disconnect about the value these things actually bring and what they do. By the way, I think this is one of the hugely underappreciated threads of the Common Core story, is that if the Common Core is understood as simply an effort to make it easier to get coherence and reading and math standards so you can give folks more useful reading, you find that parents, when it's explained to them that way, were always much more okay with it. When it became this more disconnected effort from people from way outside to come up with grandiose solutions to change their schools, parents and teachers quite naturally start to get much more concerned. And I think that tends to get lost as folks who are doing this work with all the cool kind of labels, jargon we attach to it, start to talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Does anybody have a good experience of working on something directly with a school district or school?
Hey guys, I'm just gonna let you know we're at halftime.
Okay, thank you. But to my question, hey, nobody.
I have.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
do you want to sort of share about that? Like what, are there any takeaways for people that are trying to figure that out?
So when we started Read 180, and we'd had other technology experience. When we started Read 180, first of all, it came under the umbrella of the Scholastic brand. That was hugely helpful to us. People already believed that Scholastic was a good guy. And as Rick points out, it felt like a brand because it sold to teachers and parents. It didn't feel like this big brother, top-down brand.
Trusted, in other words.
Sorry?
It was trusted.
Yeah, it felt like people thought we were a nonprofit, and sometimes we were. I think brand really matters. Sometimes when I look at sites of some of the young technology companies, I feel like they're kind of tone deaf because they're not really speaking to the emotional part of education. So, my experience with school districts, and we've had a lot of bad experiences too, and frustrating, and this whole thing of, well, just because it worked in the district next door to us doesn't mean it's going to work here, which I just don't buy that. I think the question should be, what are they doing in the district next door that we're not doing? So, to your point, I think we have to keep pushing on people to be asking those questions. But schools want to do the right thing. And I feel like a lot of selling to schools and marketing to schools is trying to help them feel like they're doing the right thing and not come across with a big club, heavy-handed. I agree with Rick, that whole scalability, it sounds like one of the challenges that we had at with Read 180 is school districts don't even want to share that much data anymore. Right. So nobody's talked about that. So that makes it really hard to do research too. So that just sort of shifted the comment I made.
So very quickly, and then this young lady wanted to ask, right there next to you.
Oh, here you go.
But if you were going to give one piece of advice to this gentleman back there about, other than brand, like is there something that somebody could do to actually, wanting to be helpful, right, to the cause?
So I would say marketing is super important. Just because you have a great product, it's just not enough. You've got to get that message that communicates with the customer about how this is actually going to help them. And I think that, and I know that just sounds sort of dumb, but it's true. If you go and look at a lot of marketing sites, they're wonky and they don't feel like they have a lot of heart. So my big advice would be to really stand back and think about what is that emotional impact of your product. Even if you have a product that's highly, highly technical, highly sophisticated, you still have to find the heart in it if you're going to sell to schools. Not true of all markets, but definitely for schools.
So that's really, just if you've already asked a question, I'm going to try to get around the room so we can make sure that everybody has a chance. Yes.
Hi, I'm a writer with EdSurge, and so I've written a few pieces about efficacy. I talked to Michael Kennedy a few times about kind of the decision-making processes that you guys have been through. And I was recently working on a story where there was one company, and it was really kind of crazy because they have over 2 million users, but there's no research, there's no anything backing any of what they're saying. And so part of my thought was how did they get 2 million users without even a stamp of accreditation of any sort? And it seemed like a lot of the districts that they worked in were kind of more rural areas, or these kind of or more like rural outskirts kind of areas they worked in.
Smaller districts.
Smaller districts, and I was thinking to myself, maybe is there something to be said about kind of maybe the way New York City and we kind of, this idea of this research backed, kind of almost seems the language almost comes off elitist sometimes even. Is that something that is deterring such people from speaking these?
So are you asking if smaller districts have an easier time procuring? I mean, I'm not quite sure.
Or just kind of trying to understand how, what the patterns they've seen with the decision-making processes with smaller districts.
Got it.
Let's go with that.
Well, our research so far doesn't show any difference. The decision making is universally terrible. It's not, it's really more about the cult of personality. If you have someone in your district who is in a leadership position who cares about this issue, they're probably going to infuse respect for research throughout their processes. They will probably have teacher agency be high up on the list of things they do, which really matters for implementation. If I run the district and I just say, we're bringing in this product without talking to anybody, and in Ruth's district, she gets buy-in from the teachers and finds out what they care about, and then they select something, you know, most products are going to be implemented better there. There are emerging groups of districts that are working together, like the League of Innovative Schools and Leap Innovation and the Silicon Valley Foundation and New York City's iZone and Schools 4.0. There are a lot of these emerging networks around the country that are trying to learn from each other and share information. So it's getting better, but the degree of difficulty is harder in rural districts because you're smaller, but the degree of difficulty is higher for different reasons in big districts where you have more students and more complexity and more complications.
Just quick follow-up, is that, have you also kind of experienced that, just seeing, are there any solutions that you've seen with this to make it more, because you said like the problems on the demand side, so are there any solutions that you've seen for the demand side, kind of?
Well, of the 10 working groups that we constituted that researched for a year and looked for potential solutions, one of them looked at schools of education to see how good a job are they doing at training tomorrow's educators to be good users of research and to infuse their faculties with those principles. And that was probably the most depressing research that we did, because my conclusion from that was that's not, schools of education are highly unlikely to change. They're not under any pressure to change. Individual faculty members largely care about their own scholarship. And as we heard from Michael Kennedy earlier this year, the kind of research that you're talking about doesn't generally get people tenure because it's not seen as academic and rigorous, and it doesn't bring funding. So,
anybody else on the panel want to respond to that?
No, I think that point about this, you know, when you think about the incentive for what research gets conducted, as a researcher, you want to conduct research that offers definite findings on a variable of interest. So moving reading and math scores, graduation rates, is good. You want data sets you get your hands on and milk the hell out of, that you can then go and shop for major funding. And the kinds of stuff that Bart's talking about is murky and mucky and yucky and really hard to make your bones on. But it's also a mistake to suggest it is. I think Bart's response about the ed schools is illuminating. Remember, Carnegie gave away $50-odd million 16, 17 years ago on the schools of tomorrow. Part of that project was to identify, it was 10 or 11 schools of education, including University of Virginia, that were going to be, were going to lead us into the shiny new 21st century. And part of that was helping researchers get more engaged with the field. So here we are 15 years later talking about how the problems still exist. But we forget that actually we tackled it. When we talk about, Bill Gates got up and said that he discovered network theory, which Tony Bright took to Carnegie back in 09. He did I love Tony, and he took it out of the work he did in Chicago, which has been so invaluable. But, under another label, let's remember that Walter Annenberg's Rose Garden gift 23 years ago was basically network theory. He gave $500 million to a dozen communities across the nation and a bunch of rural communities in order to support bottom-up, grass-fueled kind of learning and sharing. So, one of the problems we have is each time we change the name on these things, we seem to imagine that, we haven't tried this before. Most of the stuff we've actually tried before, and the reason that it didn't work is probably not just because, they weren't us. There's probably complicated stuff going on, which you would rarely know when when you sit in these things, when you sit in these panels and we talk to you.
Lauren, what's your perspective on this? Might be interesting to hear.
We work in such a different space than school districts, so.
But in terms of the higher ed angle,
so we're working on in higher ed really from a supply chain management standpoint. We're bringing in new tools and services to help solve problems that the administrators understand. We're trying to bring tools that help get their students through their clinical rotation. And so just are approaching it in a different manner. To some of the different points of coming in as a trusted source, that certainly helps. We've been working with these schools for the last 15 years. So bringing a new tool to them versus coming in as a brand new brand certainly helps from that standpoint.
do you have, what are your indicators for success? How are you looking at that?
So we're looking at, are we able to increase the number of placements for students in clinical rotations? So, a problem that we're facing in that specific industry, and so we're in a very, niche market from that, is making sure that there are enough placements available for nursing students to go in and do their clinical rotation so that they can fulfill the hours that they need to graduate. So can we increase that number by improving the communication stream by the students, the schools, and the hospitals? So we're taking those three stakeholders together to improve that. It's a brand new product that we're launching now. So that's something that we're going to be measuring, over the next couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to see 12 months from now, has that helped?
And Ruth, you have an interest, I know that PERC also works with outside researchers. Maybe you could talk about that angle a bit in terms of this question.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with the points about education schools and universities. University faculty probably not being prime candidates in general to work on this kind of thing. And there's someone every faculty who will, but on average, probably not. But there are a lot of researchers that are not in universities. They're in research firms. I happen to be in a research firm. And those folks are, well trained. They're often just as good and maybe better than some of the folks that you'll find in universities. So I think thinking about those different firms is a good place to look. I would say in the work that I do, I want to find a couple of folks here and there who are willing partners, but you have to have some really, you have to be well trained, you have to have decent people skills. You have to be able to stick to timelines.
And you need money.
And you need some money. I think that's exactly right. And so, just to that point, if I could I just wanted to come back to your question where you had sort of, I said kind of are there any models or ways of thinking about procurement and on the demand side. I don't think we have really good models for procurement. I don't think we have really good materials. I don't think people talk about it enough. I think it's one of those completely unsexy, sort of boring back office things that people don't want to kind of think about, but they're enormously consequential. I'm actually super passionate about procurement. I think there's other issues like rostering, so boring, whoever cares about this, incredibly consequential. Transportation, who cares about that? It matters a lot how you get kids to schools. So I think there's groups of people who are starting to kind of think about this. So, to me, if there were some foundation here, somebody who really wanted to put some effort into something, to me it would be start thinking about how to develop some models, materials, processes, give people some frameworks and ways of thinking about procurement and how you would incorporate research into that.
No, this is a great point. I think this goes to the Marjorie saying before about, hey, so this app which prompts a parent on something doesn't, that's good. Of course, the idea is ideally it probably does, but it's way downstream. And, right, it's not, people say, when you talk to entrepreneurs who are trying to get funded for stuff up in districts with scheduling, Acquisitions, great on this, right? They'll tell you that it's a bear to get people interested in this because it feels so far removed from outcomes. Now, the thing is, this actually matters, right? We all believe that well-run organizations which can spend money on things that matter are probably going to be better for kids in all kinds of ways, including, but the value chain to get from here to there is really long, and we don't actually have any good sense of how to study all those intervening links in the chain. So it's kind of our grain size is too fat. So we want to use this really fat grain size, and it doesn't lend itself to a lot of the stuff that we could actually tackle. So part of that too is like thinking about like, how would you know if somebody's procurement operation is much tighter? Like, what does that look like? What does that mean for real people doing real work? And this is, I think, another place where the Academy has suffered. You can't get published like that. You know, writing a paper about ways to kind of identify promising outcomes of transportation and procurement, you know, hello kind of adjunct status.
You can, but you have to theorize it. Like, find Bourdieu, put Bourdieu in there somewhere.
That's right, especially if you can get like, yeah, so that's true. But other than that, so that's also, and what that means is then it drives the whole conversation into things. It turns out it's actually really hard to move reading and math scores with kind of the interventions that folks are developing in a meaningful way, but it's really easy to move reading and math scores short term with enough elbow grease. So we wind up kind of back to Bart's problem with stuff which creates this huge bias, which probably distorts our understanding of how useful these things really are.
Yes, ma'am. Hi. So if you're a startup founder and you want to do things the right way, you want a third-party, peer-reviewed, published research about your product, but you don't have money, which is going to be the case for most of them, I'm wondering if you guys have any advice for entrepreneurs and how to accomplish the goal of efficacy.
I actually do. That one I actually have useful advice. So one of the nice things is, to Ruth's point, you know, the vendors who are actually really good and acclimated to working, the researchers really good and acclimated to working with development are actually the standalone shops, but they actually need to bill for their time. Because the people who don't need to bill are the university researchers, but senior researchers are senior researchers because they've got lines of work. The people who are actually have an appetite and have somebody else paying their bills are junior researchers. And what happens is, especially if you're doing something good and interesting, there's a real appeal to be the first researcher on it, because if they're on it, if they're writing about it, then they can ride you. This is Roland Fryer, had some early success with this, you know, Ben Castleman. So researchers have seen models where if you glom onto a promising kind of product or vendor, you can then ride them. So one of the things you want to do is figure out how do you connect with talented, kind of not yet tenured researchers who have enough going on that they can take a flyer on this because they don't want to not get tenure. But they also have to kind of have enough skill and enough kind of great. Now the nice thing, there's only a couple dozen hubs I would point out of scholars who train the folks who are actually, they're all generally going to be at elite universities because that's what gets you the prestige you want. And they're all going to be people who have a mix of kind of practical skills and research shops. And so it turns out the universe actually is not extraordinary. It's probably like 20 to 40 hub touch points, and Ruth or Bart or me or other people could probably point you to a dozen of them easy. And they're all going to have 5 or 6 people they recently trained who they'll say, email these 5 or 6, one of them's probably going to get excited about it.
Also, we got this question a lot. And what we were stunned to find out was that there is no directory. So if you want a lawyer, you go to your, and if you can't find any lawyer advertising, you can go to your county bar association, and they have a list of lawyers who are taking new clients, and they tend to be, younger lawyers who are out hustling. But the American Education Research Association doesn't do that because researchers
traditionally doesn't do much of anything.
Fair point. Because most researchers aren't in the direct-to-consumer model. There's not a lot of money to be made there. So at the University of Virginia, we decided to build something called the National Education Researcher Database, NERD, which is in final testing and will be releasing next quarter. It's a public service to help entrepreneurs find the exact type of researchers that Rick is talking about, because you, as the entrepreneur, are working on some little niche and it's really interesting to you. and you wish there's a researcher who could help you, and somewhere in the basement of a building in Lawrence, Kansas is a researcher who would love to have access to your data and would, if you can get in and meet each other when you're young and you have very little, if any, revenue, you can bring them on as an advisor, you can help them, they'll have you set up your data stores so that the data is useful down the road, and you can give them anonymized access to data, use their university's institutional review board, and that can be a very productive way to learn.
Another question?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Of course, I'm sorry.
So I think there are other ways too that I think the field is trying to really take down barriers to evaluation. And interestingly, one of the ways that they've been trying to do it is through some technology, through some software, which should make it easier to conduct rigorous studies. Now, to be honest, the two pieces of software that I'm going to talk about have not been subjected to an efficacy study around implementation or an efficacy study around impacts on some important outcomes. But so one of them is called RCE Coach, and it comes out of the Office of Ed Tech at the U.S. Department of Education. I think the software is up now. I think it's free, really available, and that, really tries to make it quite simple. It's also designed for districts who want to test their own, technology in their own environments. Another one is RCT Yes, and that's sort of a little bit more towards the skilled researcher side. But what that does is it uses a particular type of estimation method, which makes it harder for people to mess up. It sort of guides you through figuring out your treatment and comparison groups, and then it produces the output in a way that, technically you could take, a memo, staple it to this output, and the What Works Clearinghouse could review it. So there are people, I think, just working on it in different kinds of ways. Not that it's all come together yet, but.
Yes, sir.
So I had a question. We've been talking a lot about, about basically the incentives for, creating the right incentives to trigger the research, right? And the only incentives I've heard brought up are very short-term ones, right? Getting a publication, maybe grants or some type of monetary reward or incentive. For universities specifically, is there not, is it a tangible incentive that you're better educating your student body, they'll end up having stronger early careers, maybe you have a stronger alumni network, you have better reputation, you get better students, more demand for your school. I don't know, the long-term impact of better educating your students, which is really the mission, right? Is that not enough, I guess, to have the university be funding real efficacy research behind the products? Or, I don't know, does that question make sense? Is that too far removed for that to be a tangible motivator, I guess?
Bert, you want to, before Rick talks,
It's adorable.
Yeah, it's
at our school, our dean is considered somewhat of a pariah nationwide because he suggests that our graduates, that we should be measured by the impact our graduates have in the classroom. And there are people who say that's outrageous, that's not our job, or it's ridiculous. So long as we have a sharp imbalance of supply and demand, all of our, in many places, especially in schools of education, there's no competition because of these ridiculously protectionist state laws. So at the University of Virginia, if you are in the graduate business school, you can be recruited by Google in California and companies, McKinsey in Boston. You get recruited by the whole country. And if someone from Google says to the dean of the Darden School, your last couple classes of graduates have been a little weak on their quantitative skills, you bet that the dean is going to make improvements to the curriculum. But in the schools of education, there's very little interstate competition, and the buyers, so to speak, are school districts. And it's very rare that a school district will come to a school of education and say, your recent graduates don't seem very strong on project-based learning, and if you don't shape up, we're going to start taking graduates from other schools out of state. And that's a problem. It's one of those structural problems that we don't tend to talk about because it's so hard to fix that nobody wants to tackle it, and the status quo continues.
I'm going to say that you would probably agree with this.
Yeah. That's not going to be the incentive.
Right.
Sure.
Other questions? Okay, yes.
But doesn't it come back to the issue in terms of what the product is? Isn't it the whole product? Isn't that what the school district's really buying? The implementation, the results that they're getting from it versus just a whiteboard, a smart board, a piece of technology? I mean, I think unless we address it that way, nothing's really going to change. Nothing's going to be the way it should be. You know what I mean? I just think it's a case of just ed tech companies have to take the responsibility to build out the microsites, develop the support, develop the reseller network, support the product they're selling to these school districts. And if they don't do that, then it'll always be fragmented.
You know, the people who sell management information systems and software solutions to like state and municipal government have similar frustrations, because when you're dealing with public procurement, right? There's folks who are elected officials don't like to spend money on management information systems stuff. Anyway, it's not their favorite. It's money that they're not spending on like libraries and parks. And then especially on like software implementations, when you talk to folks who do this work, they're constantly frustrated that like states and localities don't want to do the follow-through maintenance, which is why you often get these stacked systems that don't speak to each other, because they don't want to pay for systems integration, and so this stuff. And so you see this, certainly is the case with public universities and school districts, that the folks who are opting to make the purchase on the front end will pay what they have to pay, but the idea that they want to spend, hundreds of thousands or millions of additional dollars for all this. And so again, like what I was saying before, that it's easy for folks who are doing this work, developing products, marketing them, to sound tone deaf to people in schools and systems. I think that's true. It's also true that people in schools and systems, and especially school boards and decision makers, tend to have this very kind of penny-wise, pound-foolish approach to a lot of their vendor engagements, especially on this tech stuff. One way you won't, a lot of this stuff, we keep wanting to talk about what's the solution to it, and there's people who are a lot smarter than me, I hope, because I have no earthly idea how do you solve some of this stuff. But I do think that we suffer because we're not as attentive to and just honest about some of the shit. So what happens is we wind up running into the same frustrations over and over, but because we're not entirely honest with ourselves or each other, we misdiagnose the problem, and so then we go back 36 months later and we have the same problem again, because we still haven't figured out why we're encountering it.
Ruth, I'm wondering what your perspective is on this.
I don't know that I have.
Okay, fair enough.
Why don't you fix this when you're on that?
Exactly.
Well,
Yes. We were putting the pieces together. Yeah,
I don't necessarily have a solution, but as a lawyer that represents technology companies, startups in particular, I'm just curious if there's comments with regard to SaaS-based solutions. In other words, you only have to buy as much as you want to try, and you can grow into products. For years, as a technology lawyer, we dealt with implementations, SLAs, RFQs, and the burdens of going through those through any district anywhere was always a nightmare for both the district and the vendor. With SaaS solutions, you can try a piece and then maybe grow it and so on. Are any of you experiencing that? Is that maybe a future route to take? Is that a better model for the education sector where a board doesn't have to make a huge decision, they have to make a little decision?
I think if I were running a foundation, one of the things I'd like to do with money is put it into developing a real rigorous chief procurement officer program, because the people who run procurement for schools should be incredibly sophisticated and experienced, and by and large, they're not. And I had a horrifying experience recently where I met someone at a cocktail party for the Chancellor of New York City, and he told me he was the chief procurement officer for a major school district in the northern Midwest, rhymes with Chicago. And I said, well, I'm fascinated to hear your story. You know, where did you go to procurement school? Which school districts did you cut your teeth in? What were your big implementations that saved millions, that got you this job? And he said, Art, what are you talking about? I was in the mayor's office, and he said, do you want to run transportation or procurement? And I said, are you kidding? He said, that's what I said. And he said, well, I thought I could kill fewer kids if I was responsible for procurement than for transportation. And when he said to the mayor, I'm not qualified for this, the mayor said to him, go talk to the people doing the job now and come back and tell me what you think. And he eventually took the job, and these management positions are so important, but they're so wonky and unaccountable and unheralded that we shouldn't be surprised that if we don't put money into those people and their training and holding them accountable, that we're going to get poor results. And the fact that you have a SaaS platform, that's a great sales pitch. You can say, we'll just turn it on and you can use what you want, but you need to have procurement officers and people who are doing implementations who understand that. Otherwise, they're at great risk of getting talked into, well, you know, you want a license for every kid, right? I mean, you don't want to be accused of limiting this just to, you know, some kids, right? And even if 80% of kids don't use their license, you still see those sales models flourishing because they work and they're scalable and they make money.
Yes, the gentleman with the red shirt.
Hi, my name is Tony Weaver, and I'm the founder of Weird Enough Productions. My question is...
Sorry, what does Weird Enough Productions do?
We use superheroes and comic books to teach middle and high school students how to combat fake news. That's
very interesting.
So my question is, especially when we're talking about researching outcomes and things like that, research and data-driven outcomes are very important. However, in the meantime, how do you all feel about entrepreneurs kind of taking that into their own hands? So for example, I'm a published media literacy researcher. I'm an emerging voice in the field. I can vouch for the program until other journals come in because I've done the research myself. However, in some cases, that could represent a clear conflict of interest. How do you all feel about startups? We may not have a lot of money, but we do have lots of time because we never really stop working. So allocating some of that time to research so that we have our own data until other people come and kind of review it from a third-party perspective.
Rick, you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, I think, so is the question really about, are there any problems? So just clarify the question for me.
Is it something that you would recommend? Would you stand behind that that kind of ideology?
So, I mean, yeah, look, I mean, I don't think you, all the points about the fact that people don't pay as much attention to, like, what efficacy, as we might like, are true. That said, you should still do it. And you're far better off teeing yourself up, because if you don't, because what happens is a lot of, right, you have so much runway, and a lot of folks who are starting up who are too busy to kind of worry about tracking that stuff, you know, holding on to it, get 2-3 years along, and then they start tracking it. But that means that you have to wait a whole lot longer to have even preliminary results. So now the trick is that you can think you're holding on to this stuff. You can think you're measuring it, tracking it, recording it, but you're not doing it in a way that's actually going to allow a third party or your researcher to actually come in and be helpful. So we're actually back to our colleague's question from before. The thing is that there are these research. Are you based in New York?
Based in Georgia.
Based in Georgia. So, you know, I mean, so it's easier if you're and are you in Atlanta or?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, so if you're in Atlanta, right, if you're in a place where there's a concentration of major universities, there's a pretty decent likelihood that there's at least a grad student, because for what you're asking about, a doctoral student can actually be helpful here. That this is something where they can actually get hands-on, learn something about the field, somebody either from like a research department or like an ed school. And So if you actually hang this up on campus, it's got an externship opportunity, even if there's zero comp, there's a reasonable chance, because what you want somebody is just to be able to say, hey, we didn't just make this up, somebody helped us talk it through it. And B, somebody who can kind of help you flag some stuff that you might otherwise, do that's gonna, hamstring you later on.
Thank you.
Any other questions from anybody that has
With that phone.
Yeah,
sorry, I couldn't see everyone.
I think what you're suggesting is not so different actually from what professors in academia who design interventions then do for themselves, especially in the early stages, So you can think about the different kinds of stages and ways that you use research in developing an intervention or developing a program, right? So you can sort of think about, you would use research, sort of more basic research, right, to sort of figure out the fundamentals of what you're trying to offer, make sure that you're not doing something that just doesn't make sense and not following the science to do. I think there's a second stage of research, which is kind of like tweaking and improving what you're trying to do. That's like what sometimes people call the A/B testing, right? Sort of make these little improvements. I think that's well within what a developer can do. And I think even early stage trials, comparing it to a reasonable alternative, that's absolutely what folks in universities will do, just to kind of see if on a small scale can we kind of get this to work. And I think Rick is right. Rick is right that what you want is to have somebody as you get towards a bigger scale, particularly to have somebody who is independent, because that gives you much more credibility. I will say, just speaking from the Clearinghouse perspective, that developer-produced research is allowed into the Clearinghouse. It will be noted that this was done by the developer, but that's allowed into.
But you probably, unless you guys are like exceptionally good at this in terms of raising money or whatever, you probably don't have the bandwidth to do that yourself. The cool thing is if you get like that researcher we were talking about before, they actually don't expect you to pay them. What they will do is they will take the access to your data, if they're interested, if they think that there's a cool value proposition here, they'll take that, they'll take the access to your data. They can then turn around and go to a foundation and raise money, which they can pay themselves. So they get compensated, but they don't get compensated from you. They get compensated because they're able to use your data and access to you in order to go get somebody to fund their research.
Bert, you wanted to?
Yes, and that's a great point, and also important to keep in mind is your niche. So who are you competing against? How sophisticated are your buyers, and what do they care about? Because I want to be careful to not give enough attention to the fact that across the 7,000 or 8,000 edtech products that there are now, some of them efficacy research is not even really on the map. But there are plenty of niches where the main competitors are using evidence of their effectiveness as a way to compete with each other. And that trend is only increasing. And it's important for entrepreneurs to not get caught unaware, because doing research is not like buying a toothbrush when you forget one on a business trip. You can't just go out and say, oh man, our main competitors has got research, and all these RFPs say we need research. You can't go back in time and do it. So get yourself a graduate student, lay the foundation, start to do it, but also really pay close attention by talking to your potential customers about what research would move them. Because there's nothing more depressing than spending a lot of money doing research and then showing it to people and having them say, I don't care. Right? Ask your customers, if I had research that showed you that students who used our product were 30% better to identify fake news on this standard fake news assessment, would that be of interest to you? Would that make it a purchase decision?
Thank you.
So I have some takeaways. I'm just wondering, we have just a few minutes left. I would really love to, I know, if anybody hasn't had a question answered, seems like everybody has. I just would love to go around the table and just, what's the takeaway for you for this session, for this group? Start with Ruth.
All right. I think one of the takeaways, one, I thought this was such a great discussion. So I feel like I learned a lot. Thank you for everybody. I hope you feel this way too. You learned a lot. I guess one of the takeaways is just, what sort of a complex and long game this is. And so when people sort of say, oh, if it were only this, if we only had, if it were only demand, or if it were only supply, or if it were only this other thing, that it will sort of be fixed. I think it sort of reminds us that there's a whole ecosystem here with different pieces of it. I would say, I came into this conversation feeling optimistic, I guess, because I don't have high expectations that things will change overnight. If you have high expectations that will change, you'll feel really sad leading this discussion. But I do feel optimistic because I think there are enough people who are sort of talking about this issue and trying to think about all of the dimensions of it that I am hoping that we will see progress.
Lauren? Oh, I'm sorry. Lauren? Some of the last comments stood out to me, and one of the biggest takeaways is as an innovator, an entrepreneur, and leading an innovation center, really understanding the sub-segments of the market and what types of research are necessary for those specific sub-segments. So that way we can understand that and approach things in a better way together.
This is a big problem that we all have a stake in, but I think that probably very few of you are going to walk out of here saying, I just learned that this is my responsibility and I need to take action. You're probably thinking, boy, Ruth and Rick and those guys, they seem like they're working on it. I'll tweet something about them. We need culture change. We need collective action. We need to start to have a desire and respect for and demand for real research infuse the culture, and that's going to take getting multiple organizations together. We also, I think, would benefit greatly from developing an educator-centric research agenda and getting more money to the Department of Education so that we can continue to do the important basic research that we're doing, but also let our nation's educators collectively decide what things do they care about, do they want research that would be of most value to them to make decisions.
Rick?
Hey, anytime you start to utter the phrase like Ruth and Rick have got, you're in deep trouble. So we don't have anything in hand, trust us. Let's see, two things. One, leads to first an invitation. A couple times a year, we do an off-the-record working group in DC to help, which primary purpose is to try to help folks who are doing things in schools and systems, as entrepreneurs, together with the research community to foster a lot of what we're talking about. If you're a venture, especially early stage venture, drop me an email. Happy to kind of talk about trying to get in the mix. I'm at rhess@aei.org. The one closing thought is just when we talk about efficacy, I thought Bart just did a really nice job of being like, look, on the fake news recognition assessment, are we moving them, right? That's again narrow brain size. Are we moving things that educators and parents really care about? Remember that when we survey parents, when we ask parents where where test scores rank, when we ask them what in the criteria that they think make a good school, reading and math scores tend to finish 8th, 10th, 12th. Parents rank a lot of things, and that means schools, which are torn between accountability systems which emphasize reading and math scores, and parents for whom reading and math scores are reasonably far down the list of to-dos, tend to be somewhat ambivalent. So don't imagine that the fact that you can show some kind of impact on reading and math score is a game changer. And don't imagine the fact that what you're offering doesn't necessarily have a short-term impact on reading and math scores ought to be a huge problem. What are you doing that's good for children? How do you actually convince people it does what it's supposed to do? And if you can do that and show that you're doing things that are good for kids, that's efficacy. And the odds are you're going to actually be able to be more effective at convincing real people that this is something that deserves a careful look.
And there are resources out there. So I think we want to thank all of our panelists. They really did a fantastic job. And thank all of you for